Good morning, everyone. It's a little past 11, so I think we can get started here. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. I think we have a great topic here to talk about. This is a Zoom meeting, so everybody needs to mute their audio. And please put your questions in the chat, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. So my name is Peter Williams. I am an officer of both the Stockbridge Historical Commission and the Stockbridge Historic Preservation Commission, which is the body that was set up by the town bylaw to administer Stockbridge's demolition delay bylaw. And the bylaw is, I think, something that's fairly unique in Massachusetts. It's been in effect for 15 years in Stockbridge, and it's been very effective, we think, in saving a lot of historic buildings in Stockbridge. And it's come to our attention that perhaps the bylaw isn't well known elsewhere, and it's a potentially valuable tool for protecting historic buildings that could be utilized as it is or modified to fit your own particular uses in other towns and cities across Massachusetts and even beyond. So let's get into the situation and see what we can learn here. Except that my screen isn't advancing right now, so we'll just advance it manually. So the current historic demolition situation in Massachusetts is one that I think we're all aware of. There are increasingly strong demolition pressures across the state that have led to the demolition of many historic structures across the state. And the most common response, I believe, to these pressures has been that over 150 towns in Massachusetts have adopted so-called demolition delay bylaws or ordinances. And a demolition delay, by its name, is sort of obvious. It helps you to delay the demolition of a historic structure. And this gives you a sense of how many towns in Massachusetts now have demolition delay bylaws. All the towns in green have one. And we're up here in Stockbridge, over in the way western part of the state with our bylaw. And obviously, a lot of other towns have them. The problem with these demolition delay bylaws is that almost all of them are time limited. And over on the left side of your screen here, you can see that this is from Massachusetts Historical Commission as of last spring. There was a very long list of towns that have demolition delay bylaws. And you can see in the right-hand column that they all have different periods of months that they work to delay the demolition. But essentially what happens is if somebody wants to demolish a historic building, they come in, they file their application for demolition. It goes to the regulatory body who can decide whether a delay is appropriate or not. And I don't mean to totally denigrate these demolition delay bylaws. They can be valuable. They have been valuable in a number of cases where there's a period where the municipality can work with the developer or the homeowner, whoever it is that wants to demolish their building, to try to come up with some alternative way to save the building. Unfortunately, though, in many cases, a delay is just that, a delay, and it ultimately leads to the demolition of the structure in question. For many developers, in fact, the demolition delay is just a little speed bump on the way to their ultimate goal. It just gives them time to work on the plans, to maybe line up their financing a little more, and they can just wait it out. And a lot of them are, I think, able to do that and have done it in a number of cases. So unfortunately, too often, this is the result, that you have a nice historic home that is demolished. This particular photo is from Martha's Vineyard, but I think many of us have seen this happen all around the Commonwealth. And of course, it's very painful when it does happen. So we have a solution to talk about today, at least a potential solution, here in Stockbridge. And Stockbridge is kind of a quintessential New England town. This particular image is one of downtown Stockbridge painted by Norman Rockwell, who lived in Stockbridge for the last 30 or so years of his life. And this shows the main street, the main business district, if you will. It's a very small town. We have about 1,900 full-time residents of Stockbridge and about another 1,900 seasonal residents. And so this is our little downtown, and it's been unchanged for well over 100 years. And you can see it has quite a lot of character. And Stockbridge is a town that a lot of people come to visit and come to live in because they really appreciate the historic character of the town. In that character, you can see we were established in 1737. That's not exactly early for some towns in Massachusetts, but there's a lot of history in Stockbridge, and a lot of that history is reflected in different periods where there are buildings from those periods. So we have buildings, wonderful ones from the colonial period that still survive. We have buildings from different phases of the 19th century and the early 19th century. We, like a lot of towns in New England, had kind of a mini industrial revolution where water power was used to power mills in the town. And then in Stockbridge, at least in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, there was a strong era of Gilded Age building going on where wealthy second homeowners would build, in many cases, although they called them cottages, they were wonderful large homes that they would use seasonally in Massachusetts, in Stockbridge when they came to visit. So the question began to arise in Stockbridge as the 20th century wore on. Is there a way to protect our historic fabric from the pressures that we began to see arising, and that I think we've seen arise in many other towns and municipalities around the Commonwealth, where you begin to have pressures for development, for people coming into town who aren't really in love with an old building and want to have their own particular new building. And so that the leaders of the town of Stockbridge began to try to think of ways to protect the historic buildings in town. And the first thing they tried was something that's pretty widely known in Massachusetts. It's in Title VII, I believe, called Chapter 40C, and it's a historic district. And many of you are familiar with historic districts. They have them in other states too. In New York State, I think they call them landmark districts. And the idea with a historic district is you define a specific geographic area in town and you define that as a district. But of course, it has to be adopted by the citizens of the town. In Stockbridge and in many other towns, that requires a 2/3 vote of the town meeting. This particular image here, incidentally, is another Norman Rockwell image. This is from his famous freedom of speech image, and it's of a quintessential New England town meeting. So you had to go before the town meeting and convince the town, in this case, this was the first effort that was made to adopt a historic district. And they defined the area in downtown that you saw in the prior image and up and down Main Street where some of the oldest and most famous houses were. And the problem with the historic district, at least as far as the voters in Stockbridge were concerned, is that the regulations can be quite strict. The laws provide for a historic district commission to regulate any changes to the exterior of any building in the historic district, and even ancillary structures like fences and so forth. And it controls, for example, often what color paint and windows. And some of the people in Stockbridge felt that that was too strict. And the town selectmen brought a historic district bylaw before the town several times in the late 90s, and they never could get the 2/3 vote that they needed. So they sort of went back to the drawing board and thought a little bit. And the next idea they came up with was to reach out to the public at large. And they just made this known at meetings of the selectmen and publications in the local paper and so forth, saying, we are putting together an ad hoc group of citizens to try to come up with a bylaw that will be politically viable in Stockbridge, but that will also help to protect our historic buildings in the town. And so there was a bunch of people that responded to this. I was one of them, but it was a very diverse group of people that stepped forward. I'm a lawyer. There was one other lawyer, but there were people from the real estate agent community. There were just longtime residents of Stockbridge who loved their town and wanted to be involved in helping to preserve it. There were historians that had written about some of the historic buildings in town. And so we all got together. We worked closely with our town council, the lawyer that is on retainer to the town from a prominent Boston area law firm, so well-versed in what we need to do to stay cognizant with Massachusetts law as we proceeded. And we worked, this was a several-year process, and we worked hard to come up with something that we thought would be viable, that we thought the voters would approve, and that we thought would actually help to protect the historic buildings in Stockbridge. And one of the things we did that I think, if you decide to do this in your town, it's not rocket science to think about it, but we made sure to keep the town in the loop as we proceeded. We would make announcements at the annual town meeting. Yes, we're still meeting, we're working on it. And then when we finally had a draft bylaw that we were planning to put before the town meeting, we had several informational sessions in town, one at the library, one at the town hall, where we invited anybody to come to raise questions. And we had, whiteboards with the key language of the bylaw so we could explain it easily in an open session. We had pictures, large blow-ups of some recent demolitions that had occurred in town that were thought by a number of townspeople to be very unfortunate developments. And frankly, I think that was quite helpful in getting the bylaw passed. There was really a sense in town that the development pressures in the town were growing in a way that we really needed to do something. And so let me skip ahead to the next slide and talk a little bit about what we came up with. So the full text of the bylaw is in the resources that are available as a link annexed to this presentation at the website. So I'm just going to summarize it broadly here. First of all, what we did, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So there is a standard form of demolition delay bylaw in Massachusetts that was created by the Massachusetts Historical Commission. It's available from the MHC, but we have a copy of it also as a resource here that I obtained from the Mass Historic Commission so that we could share it with you all. So you can see the standard demolition delay bylaw. And just to sort of briefly recap, so we're all on the same page in terms of what is in a standard demolition delay bylaw and basically fundamentally how it operates. The basic question is the building a significant historic building? And there are two ways to define a significant historic building that are sort of common in the field and that are set forth in some detail in the standard form bylaw. The first is whether the structure is associated with historic people, events, or other important history or character of the town. So that's basically that it's a historic building because of people or events or being part of an important fabric of a town, representative perhaps of an important development phase in the town historically or something along those lines. And the other alternative is architectural significance. And it can be one or the other, it doesn't have to be both. And you can have architectural significance individually if you have a unique architectural building, perhaps designed by somebody, a significant architect, or as a group. You may sometimes have a group of houses that perhaps individually aren't that exciting architecturally, but they are important as a group architecturally together. Now, one tool that we use in Stockbridge quite a lot when we're approaching this question of whether a particular building is a significant historic building is the acronym here that you see on your screen, MACRIS or MACRIS, which there's actually going to be a session about MACRIS tomorrow at 10 a.m. So if you want to learn more about MACRIS, you can go there. It stands for, I hesitate to see if I can come up with it, but Massachusetts Cultural Resource Information System, I think. And what you have at MACRIS, it's done by the Massachusetts Historical Commission. It's available online. You can just Google MACRIS and it'll come up. And you can go to any town and there on the website are all the buildings and areas in the town that have been cataloged in the Mass Historic Commission's catalog of historic resources around the state and in your particular community. So in Stockbridge, various records were created starting all the way back in the 70s. A lot of individual building forms were created by the local historical commission. And then in the 90s, the historical commission hired a professional historian who came in and surveyed the town and chronicled a bunch of historic areas in town. And there's specific forms for that. There's a building form and an area form, both of which the Massachusetts Historical Commission has. And if they're properly filled out and filed with the commission, the house or the area will end up in MACRIS. And so when we in the regulatory body that administers our bylaw, gets an application for a potential demolition, the first place we look is on MACRIS to see if the house is in a significant area, is a contributing house to a significant area, or is got an individual building form filed in its own right. And of course, MACRIS includes all National Register historic districts, all landmarks, and so it's really a wonderful resource that collects everything all in one place. So I recommend it to you. And so now let me go back to what we did in Stockbridge. So we started with that standard form, demolition delay bylaw, and we looked at it and we wondered if it would work in our town and what there might be that we could do to improve it, thinking about the realities of Stockbridge. And so we modified the standard form bylaw in two important ways. First, depending on the circumstances, the delay that is provided for by the Stockbridge demolition delay bylaw could last indefinitely. And that's obviously a very important change from 6 months, 12 months, or 18 months. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail in the next slide. But let me just also tell you a little bit about the second change that we made, and that was to cover substantial alterations. And I don't think this is an absolutely necessary change, but what we were thinking about was the fact that some crafty would-be demolisher might say, oh, well, I have a way to get around this. I'll just keep a small percentage of the historic building standing, and I'll tear down the rest, but I'll just call it an alteration. And we were afraid that some crafty person might come up with that idea. So we wanted to cover substantial alterations as well. And we set a threshold where we would at least look at what the would-be demolisher, in this case, the would-be alterer, is doing. And our threshold is 500 square feet, either taking away 500 square feet of the building, adding 500 square feet to it, or altering 500 square feet of the exterior. And that just brings the application to us for a threshold look. In many cases, the proposed alteration is fine, and we easily and quickly pass it. Zoom meetings, frankly, are a wonderful tool for a quick review, and we're a pretty pragmatic and frankly friendly regulatory body, and so people come before us. The standard for what is a substantial alteration, there's some long language in there, and it's a little bit subjective, but basically what you're talking about is, are you essentially destroying what makes the historic building significant? And so it really has to be pretty bad before we call it a substantial alteration that does not pass muster under the bylaw. Sometimes we just work with the person who's come before us with their plans, and we say, well, what about doing this instead of that? And usually a friendly process can result in an alteration that's fine. It lets the owner of the property achieve what they would like to achieve while still preserving the historic integrity of the building. One other thing I'll say about our bylaw that I think is important compared to a historic district is that the bylaw covers, as every demolition delay bylaw does, it covers the entire town or city if you're in a city. And so part of the beauty of that is you're not limited to a strict geographic area. So in Stockbridge, there are a number of very important, significant historic buildings that are outside of the downtown area that would have been protected had a historic district been adopted. And so part of the beauty of a bylaw like this is that it protects not just a limited district, so it has sort of the strict protections of a historic district, but it really covers the entire town. And one of the reasons I think we were able to pass this at the town meeting, though, is our standards are less strict. As I say, an alteration has to be substantial in the way that I described. So homeowners are free to paint their house any color they want. They can change the front gate. Usually they can change the windows. These things can be replaced, but a building that is demolished cannot be replaced. So we opted for somewhat looser controls, but also having a broader geographic coverage. One little note here that I just do want to say is that under Massachusetts law, all these bylaws have to be, once they're approved by the town, if it's the town meeting or whatever town regulatory body you have to create town bylaws or ordinances, the Attorney General is required to take a look at it and make sure that it passes muster with the AG's office. And our bylaw did go before the Attorney General's office back in 2006, and it did pass muster. It was approved. So let me talk about how the delay can be indefinite, and these ways for providing for the bylaw to be indefinite were something that we worked out closely with town council, because it's obviously important. You can't take away a private property owner's rights entirely to get the full value and use out of their property, and you have to proceed in a way that, as I say, can pass muster with the Attorney General and with Massachusetts law in general. So here's what our bylaw did. Once a building is deemed to be significant, it may not be demolished unless the homeowner makes one of two possible showings. So these are alternative showings. The homeowner does not have to show both. So the first, which is a little bit difficult for the homeowner to prove, but it's happened, I think, once in the history of our bylaw, is a finding of no likelihood that any other entity would purchase and save the building. So essentially, I think what this means in common sense terms is that the building is really too far gone. There's no person out there that's ever going to save this building. And by the way, let me just say one other thing about our bylaw, which I think is true of most demolition delay bylaws. If the building has become a hazard and is a safety hazard, it can be condemned by the town building inspector. And so this is, in this particular case, the no likelihood test is a building that's probably gone pretty far. It's not quite to the condemned safety hazard stage, but it's pretty much of a wreck, and it can't, and no reasonable person can imagine anybody buying and saving it. And in that case, the regulatory body can just okay the demolition. In a sense, it's already too late. The second alternative, which is the more common one that really comes up in practice, requires the owner to put the house on the market. And the owner has to make, I just quoted a little bit of the language here, but a continuing bona fide and reasonable effort to sell the building to a purchaser who is willing to save it. And that reasonable effort, and there's a lot of language in the bylaw defining exactly the terms of that reasonable effort. You have to hire a real estate agent, you have to offer it a fair market value, and other details like that. We can talk about that more during the questions if anybody's interested. But they have to do this for 12 months, market the property for 12 months. And if 12 months goes by and there's nobody who has come forward who says, yes, I would buy the property for a fair market value and I would save it, then the demolition can proceed. But if there is another buyer who will come forward to save the property, then under the bylaw, the homeowner has to make a choice. He can say, oh, okay, I decided not to sell it because I really was hoping nobody would buy it, and or the owner sells the property. And so, as I say, we've had 15 years worth of real life experience with this bylaw, and we have found that it works in 3 ways to save buildings in practice. The first is that the bylaw is now widely known in town. Most homeowners know about it. Certainly all of the real estate agents in town know about it, and just as a matter of good practice, they will certainly tell prospective buyers that, gee, this house is historic. Just make sure you understand there's a bylaw in Stockbridge that regulates your ability to demolish historic buildings, so you better know about that before you buy it. And so in many cases, what you have is a deterrent effect. people who already own a house and are trying to decide what to do with it know that it's not so easy to tear down a historic house. And a would-be buyer often will move on to greener pastures if their true desire is to build something new and they were just hoping to do a tear down and build a new. If they want to build a new, they've either got to find a vacant lot or find a lot without a historic building on it. And so that essentially keeps, so in many cases, the bylaw acts as a gatekeeper, and applications simply don't come before us. I mean, in terms of actual applications for demolition, we get, I would say, less than a handful on average every year. So people know about the bylaw and generally speaking can think in advance as to whether or not they want to proceed in a way with respect to their property that will bring them before our commission. And many people just don't bother because they know that they can't tear down a significant historic building in Stockbridge. But people do bring applications, and I've got two specific examples. I'll give you each one of the two ways that the bylaw has worked in practice when people do bring an application. One is that the applicant changes their mind once the building is deemed historic. And that can happen for two reasons. One, they might just be hoping that it won't be deemed historic and they'll get to tear down their building. And then when they find it's been deemed historic, then they say, oh, okay, this is more trouble than I thought, so I'm going to rethink my plan. Another thing that has happened, and that happened in the example I'm going to show you next, is that sometimes the homeowner just does not appreciate the historical significance of their building. And you know, we try to be a friendly, as I say, regulatory body. And when somebody comes before us, we're not mean or anything. We do our research. We find out what is the potential historic nature of the building. And we will describe to the homeowner in detail. And if it goes all the way to us rendering an official writing, we'll do an official writing that will explain in detail why the building is historic. And a lot of times people are surprised that their building is historic, and they have a new appreciation of the building and decide they don't want to tear it down. And they also, I think, to some extent, get a new appreciation of how the people in Stockbridge feel that historic preservation is really an important value for our town. And someone who wants to be a good community member is often sensitive to that as well. The other alternative is that that second approach is adopted. The property is put on the market for a year to see if anybody will buy it. And indeed, someone does come forward and does buy it. And so that, of course, can be a happy result as well. The homeowner gets back, who sells it, who wanted to demolish it, gets back the fair market value of their property, and they can go elsewhere if they were dreaming of building new construction and go build their new construction elsewhere. And the community at the whole is benefited because now the property is in the hands of someone who is committed to saving it. And so let me give you an example of each one of those developments that has happened in real life in Stockbridge. So the first example here is where the homeowner changes their mind because they learn more about the property and its historic significance. So this particular property is kind of a particularly notable one. It was built in 1906 by one of these well-to-do people from New York City who was building a summer home in the country. And they built this. It's on a beautiful site in Stockbridge, about 3/4 of a mile outside of town on a hill facing south. And it's a wonderful site. And so indeed, they called the property Wayborn Hill. And the interesting thing is when the homeowner who bought this, so a lovely couple from the eastern part of the state bought the property and came before us with an application to demolish it. And they loved the site, but perhaps didn't think the building was all that meaningful and wanted to tear it down and build something similar on the site. And so interestingly enough, this particular house, through various oversights, was not in any of the Mass Historic Commission's records. And so we, in this case, had to go back and do the spade work to determine whether this was or was not a significant historic building. And we applied those standards that I talked about earlier in the hour. And it was, in fact, amazing how historically significant this building was. And in this case, it was particularly, it was kind of a mixture of the people who had lived in it and how the building was so reflective and emblematic of the culture of Stockbridge throughout the 20th century. The couple who built it was quite notable. It was a series of notable people. And just to give you a little hint, admittedly, it has to be kind of a notable property. But in this case, one of the tools we used was simply newspapers.com. And happily, a number of the local papers in Berkshire County are on newspapers.com. And you could go in there and put in Weybourne Hill. And there was an amazing amount of material because the local papers were constantly following the different succession of owners of Weybourne Hill. They were almost to a person notable people who did notable things that were very important to the history of the town, in some cases to the history of the country at large. And so just to briefly touch on a couple of them, the original homeowners were involved in the education of African-American youth back in the very early 20th century. They corresponded with Booker T. Washington. Some of that correspondence is in his collected writings. And so they were significant, sort of emblematic of kind of a progressive streak of some of these people that lived in Stockbridge in the 20th century. They sold the property to a couple of artists, a husband and wife, who were both very notable artists who had art that hangs in the National Gallery today. Those people were very involved in the culture of the town. Another famous Stockbridge artist is Daniel Chester French, who has a property in town called Chesterwood. And you all know, I think, Daniel Chester French. He is the sculptor who did the Minuteman in Concord and who did the seat of Lincoln at the Lincoln Memorial. And they used to get together, the Frenches and the subsequent owners of Weybourne Hill, and they'd have art shows in Stockbridge, and they'd get together at their various houses, and it would all be written up in the local papers. Some owners after that, there was the producer of the play A Raisin in the Sun. There's a summer stock theater in Stockbridge that brings theater people, and in this case, a producer bought this house, and he is the man who produced A Raisin in the Sun, which was I think a major civil rights turning point in the early 1960s. It was the first play on Broadway that had a primarily Black cast, a Black playwright, a Black director. And so this was another subsequent owner. When he sold the property, he sold it to a movie star who is an international film star. And it's actually the film star who sold the property to the current owners. So anyway, long story short, when the current owners learned all this, they changed their minds and are now embarking on a restoration of the property that's actually going to bring it back to its really original glory. The windows you see here are not the original windows, but they have pictures of the original windows, and they're going to restore the house in a way. They came before us with their plans, and we approved the plans, and it's really a wonderful result. I think they're happy, and the community as a whole benefits. So let me just talk one last example. This is the example of a new buyer saving the house. So let me just say a word about the historic significance of this house. It's called Lake Cottage. It's part of a National Register district called the Shadowbrook Farm National Register District. So this house was chronicled in Macris, and as I say, it's part of a National Register district. And it's primarily, Shadowbrook Farm is a farm that was mostly built during the Gilded Age. It's a farm that serves a large Gilded Age mansion that's up on the hill above the farm. And in this case, this particular house, you can see 1780 date, was a farmhouse that was already on the property when the well-to-do people from New York bought a huge section of property in the 1890s in Stockbridge to build their dream Gilded Age mansion. And so this farmhouse was included in what they bought. And rather than tear down the farmhouse, they kind of modified it. The estate is Tudor style, and they modified the estate, the farmhouse in this case, to kind of look Tudor style to match the rest of the estate. And it is part of the National Register district, but it was always owned privately from the time, well, it was sold by the family at one time that had built the Gilded Age mansion. So for many years in the 20th century, it was owned privately. And the last homeowner decided he wanted to demolish it. And you can see from that newspaper clipping on the left that it came very close to being demolished. The homeowner, frankly, was not really complying with the bylaw, which became clear when the giant backhoe showed up on the property. But he had already removed all the historic windows. You can kind of see there in the back of the picture in the newspaper, and was getting ready to have a demolition. And frankly, this is an example of the townspeople getting involved. They saw what was happening, and people showed up. They called the local newspaper, who came down, took this picture, and one thing led to another, and that led to the demolition being stopped at that point. And so the homeowner then did go through the procedure of the bylaw, putting it on the market. And I think he kind of thought that nobody would buy it. But happily, a couple who is interested in owning a historic property bought it and has restored it, as you can see here in the picture. And for example, they found old photographs of the house and restored the historic windows, and just generally did a beautiful job. So it's another example of the bylaw, I think, working in a fabulous way. I'll just say a couple words. I don't want to end on a down note, but just a couple words about some of the limitations of the bylaw, and then we'll go to questions. The bylaw, it does not regulate demolition by neglect. Frankly, we didn't really think about this when we were writing the bylaw. You know what demolition by neglect is. It's where the homeowner essentially just lets the building go, and it eventually gets to a point where it might meet that first standard for demolition where no reasonable person would save it. Or in some cases, the building inspector comes along and says this building is a safety hazard and has to go. There are some towns in Massachusetts that are working on trying to regulate demolition by neglect. If you just Google Massachusetts and demolition by neglect, you'll find a few. And so it's something worth thinking about. It's not in our bylaw. There are some significant buildings in town that are being demolished by neglect, I'm sorry to say. And it's something we might try to do at some point. But it's, again, you have to think about what can you pass in your town. And that's I think, a harder thing to get people to agree to. So it's a tough one, and so far we haven't tackled it. Sometimes we have found there's less public support for saving vernacular buildings. I think everyone agrees, for example, looking at Weybourne Hill there, or at the Shadowbrook Historic District House, that these were houses everybody can agree should be saved. We've wrestled on our regulatory commission with houses that are much more vernacular. We've saved some, but sometimes we always ask ourselves, is this a structure that we're going to get blowback from the community, where they'll say, gee, that isn't what we thought we were adopting when we passed the bylaw. So we struggle with vernacular structures, but we've saved a number of vernacular structures, particularly if they're already somewhere in the recorded documents in MACRIS. Usually that gives us the muscle to save them. If we have to try to make a case anew, it's very hard to do at this point, I think. And the last thing we didn't really think about that's come up once or twice is if a building is on a large lot with multiple buildings, but there's only one building that the applicant wants to demolish, how does the bylaw work in terms of that provision about putting the property on the market? And push has never really come to shove with this, but it's something that the put it on the market way of allowing demolition doesn't really fit very well with. And so far, it's never really, as I say, been an issue, but it's something we've realized as the 15 years have gone on that we didn't really think about at the beginning. But I would say in general, the bylaw has been an amazing thing for saving historic structures in town. It's been very successful. It's part of what I think has kept Stockbridge to be a community that people really want to live in, want to visit, and we're very happy with it. So I'm happy to be able to share with you a little bit about the bylaw. We have time for questions here, so I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to go to the chat, hopefully, and start answering some questions if I can do this. So the first question here is, does your first condition to bypass the demo delay ever lead to an owner letting the building fall into disrepair? So that was a good question that was asked early before I talked about that. And I'm not sure that people deliberately plan for that outcome, but it's something that could happen. And I think it's a good question. You know, there's no doubt that these bylaws are not perfect. And there are cases where a determined would-be demolisher can sort of think of ways to get around it. Next one, have you encountered any instances where owner buys property and then something catastrophic like pipes bursting due to failure to winterize happens? How best to navigate this using the Stockbridge model? So I would say that has not happened so far. You know, I think it would have to be pretty serious damage to the building. I think the homeowner could come back and say, hey, things have changed. Now no reasonable person would save this building. But it would have to be a pretty major change. So I kind of feel like the bylaw can handle that sort of a situation. And happily, it hasn't happened so far, knock on wood. Next question, what % of historic properties in Stockbridge are commercial versus residential? Has the demo delay bylaw curtailed economic development at all? What has been the impact on property values of historic residential and community and commercial properties? To answer the last question first, of course, a lot of us have seen what's been happening to property values, particularly outside of the major metropolitan areas in these times of COVID. Real estate prices in Stockbridge are rising. And so there certainly has not been a negative effect on homeowners in that regard. Has the demolition delay bylaw curtailed economic development? And what do we say about commercial properties? So frankly, there is not a lot of commercial property in Stockbridge. We actually had a issue come before the town meeting this year, back in May, where we specifically regulated turning any of the commercial buildings in Stockbridge. We said, you can't make a commercial building entirely residential, because you may have seen in that picture of downtown Stockbridge, there are Victorian houses that are part of the downtown business district. And there was a fear that people are just going to turn all these into residences too. And pretty soon we'd have no commercial properties in Stockbridge. So we actually said, if you have a commercial property, you have to keep the ground floor commercial. You can't change that. So that's a little taste of how this has impacted commercial properties in Stockbridge. Obviously, bigger towns will have different issues that you'll certainly want to think about in your town or city. So let's read the next one. Yes, does the bylaw include language that maintains demo delay in the event of disaster? Okay, so that's following up on the prior question. Some buildings in my own town have been lost to suspicious fire. Ooh, that's creepy. So a new archaeology survey bylaw we are working on includes language that includes a 3-year wait on construction imposed on the parcel in the event of a disaster, including fire. So that's a pretty good idea. I welcome that comment. I don't know, maybe sometimes in Stockbridge we're a little bit removed from some of the harsh realities of other parts of the world. And so far, at least in Stockbridge, no one's thought of that, thank goodness. Next one, what percentage of the municipalities that have demo delays are certified local governments? Will this demo delay help fulfill requirements of CLG program? So I confess, I do not know the answer to that question. And so let me forge ahead just to cover everything. Uh-oh, we got another one. It's the CLGs. Oh, so maybe this is someone responding. So thank you. Many of the CLGs have a demo delay bylaw, but it does not qualify a community for CLG status. Only the adoption of a 40C historic district does. So thank you very much, Jen. Next question. Why did you not vest the authority to manage the demolition bylaw in the historical commission? Good question. So in many cases, the demolition delay bylaw is administered by the historical commission. In this particular case, the historical commission, frankly, just didn't want to do that. Our bylaw does incidentally provide specific people that need to be on the regulatory body. So it provides for a 7-member regulatory body And so one of the members has to be from the historical commission, so that there's constant interface between the historical commission and the regulatory body, which is called the Historic Preservation Commission. I happen to be that person that's on both commissions. So when we get a historic issue, if there's any question that might be relevant to the historical commission, I'm the person who's able to run it by the historical commission. In terms of other people that are specified to be on the bylaw, they're specified to be a real estate agent. They're specified to be a contractor who's knowledgeable about the potential restoration of historic buildings. So it provides for experts to be on the commission, so that we don't just have a bunch of people that don't know anything about some of the issues in town. So that's how we decided to do it. And by having a separate body, it does enable you to specify certain people to be on the regulatory body that might not just be on a historical commission. So it gives, I think, a greater diversity of views when we're considering a demolition application. But I would say in general, we don't end up at loggerheads. Usually we reach unanimous decision, but there have been some cases where the decision has not been unanimous, and we can operate by a majority vote. Next question, am I correct that the adoption of this demolition delay bylaw only required a majority vote at the town meeting rather than a 2/3 vote? No, I'm sorry, I meant to say that it required a 2/3 vote. And so that's important to think about when you're planning your initiative to try to get something passed. And we were planning for that, and we got about a 3/4 vote. The main opposition in our case came from the real estate community, if you will. They were, I think, afraid of change, but in the end, I don't think they've felt that change happened in a way that was deleterious to real estate. In fact, frankly, I think it's helpful to real estate values in Stockbridge that Stockbridge retains its historic character. I think that's why a lot of people want to live in Stockbridge. So I'm skipping the next one. That's Preservation Massachusetts commenting. So the next question, in Northborough, our historic district bylaw from 1973 removed some 40C restrictions such as landscaping, house color, walkways to make it more friendly to owners. The emphasis is to retain the basic architecture from the street view. Our problem is a short 6-month delay. So yes, so that's a good way that perhaps we could have skinned the cat in Stockbridge to try to get a historic district bylaw adopted. But as I say, in a way, we're happy that we ended up with something that covers the entire community and not just a specific geographic part of town. Next question, do you think this bylaw would pass in today's environment in your community? Very interesting question. Our community has a 6-month demo delay bylaw passed in 2004 with lots of support at the time and works generally well for partial demolitions, but it's just a speed bump for full demolitions, where there has been several in recent times in our community. I am not so certain that our 2004 6-month demo delay bylaw would pass due to a much reduced interest in preservation. So that's a good question. Clearly, you need to think about the political realities in your town or city. You know, at least in a town like Stockbridge, I think we continue to value the historic character of the town. So I like to think that we could still pass that bylaw today, but you know, we don't know unless we try. Next question, what is the process of notification in Stockbridge? When do owners need to come before the SHC? So incidentally, so the bylaw is in your resources, so you can see all the details of the bylaw. But to answer the question, the way it works in Stockbridge is if you want to demolish a building, any building, even if it's only 10 years old, you have to go to the building inspector for a permit. And so he's the initial gatekeeper. And whenever the building inspector gets a building, and we have a 50-year-old threshold. So if the building is more than 50 years old, he refers the homeowner to a form. We have a simple 1-page form for the homeowner to fill out. And the homeowner then fills out the form and sends it on to the Historic Preservation Commission, and we then review the application. And you know, as I say, we try to act speedily and in a friendly and non-confrontational way, and usually that's the way it works. Next question, is there a provision where the building commissioner automatically notifies historical commission whenever a demo permit is applied for? So this was a very prescient question, And so the answer to that is yes, under the actual specific terms of the bylaw. Next question, have you ever had legal pushback on a property you found to be historically significant? Someone claiming something isn't historic in an effort to tear it down. So I think there's two questions there. To focus on the second one first, someone's claiming something isn't historic. We certainly have had people try to argue that, oh, it's just really not historic. It may be on Macris, but this building is not historic for whatever reason. And we'll have some back and forth. We've had people even bring in professional historians to make an argument, and we'll have some back and forth, and eventually the commission will reach a decision as to whether we think it's historic. And if somebody doesn't agree, incidentally, it's unique to our bylaw, and you don't necessarily have to do this. Our bylaw provides for an appeal to the town planning board, because we're an appointed body, and we didn't feel like as an appointed body we should have the final say. The planning board is an elected body, and so if somebody doesn't like our decision, they can appeal to the planning board. So far, the planning board, I think, has only overruled us once or maybe twice. So usually we're well received at the planning board, but it does give the homeowner another chance. The question of another question about legal pushback that I think is just worth touching on, at least happily in our case, no one has ever tried to challenge the entire bylaw, and say the Attorney General didn't know what they were talking about. Obviously, a really determined person could do that, but you'd be looking at a long period of litigation, and I think most people aren't very excited about doing that. Let's see, somebody asked for my contact information. There's a couple ways you can find me. One is if you go to the town of Stockbridge on our website, you can find an email link to both the Historical Commission and the Historic Preservation Commission, and you can send us an email. I'm the secretary of both commissions, so they come to me. But you can also email me. It's my full name, which is Peter, and then there's a dot, and my middle name, Chase, and then there's another dot, and my last name, Williams, and that's @Gmail address. Will these Q&A be included in materials at the end of the day for review? I think the answer to that is yes. And thanks to everyone about the process, but for major developments, it is late in the game when the owner submits for a building permit. Have you tried to involve the Preservation Commission when a developer is at the site plan review or planning board? So that's an interesting question, and a good question, I think. Right now, the planning board in Stockbridge knows about the historic preservation bylaw. So, and I actually know that in Stockbridge also, in many cases, you have to go before the selectmen for a special permit if you want to have a substantial development. And in some cases, the select board has referred the developer to the Historic District Commission. And I will add on top of that, we also, another way we don't stand on formality is that we actually don't require somebody to file a demolition application to be heard as to whether or not their building is a significant historic building. So sometimes if a homeowner is just thinking about buying a building, we will hear their application if it's a bona fide person who's obviously seriously considering it. And they come to us and we'll say, listen, here's what we think. And sometimes that'll make the homeowner decide not to buy it if we say it is a significant historic building, or the opposite if we say it's not. And so in other cases, as I say, for example, the select board will refer somebody to the Historic Preservation Commission, essentially almost get an advisory opinion. So you do get it earlier in the process, because you're right, sometimes if you're waiting until somebody's all ready to do a demolition, it can be rather late in the game. So we try to be flexible about that. If somebody were writing a bylaw anew, they might actually want to provide that in the bylaw anew. And so we've got some thank yous here, and I see it's 5 minutes of noon. So I should probably stop speaking, but if anybody has any last questions, what have you, feel free to raise them. And otherwise, I really appreciate the opportunity to explain about the Stockbridge bylaw, and I hope perhaps some of what we have learned and done in our town might be helpful to others. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the 2 days of this event. I think it's a fabulous event, and I thank Preservation Massachusetts for the opportunity to share what we have learned. So thank you all.